How good can it be? That's the question we're going to answer today, as this is the second part of my Jack Mason Canton review. Jack Mason's latest, which is a go anywhere, do anything powerhouse, and their most ambitious watch to date in terms of movement and quality. There'll be a link to part 1, which is more of the regular review down below, just to get you caught up. But here, to answer that question of how good is it, we're going to do a comparison or a versus video between the Canton and two of its more obvious competitors. A watch from Christopher Ward and a watch from Monta. And before we begin, I do have some boring yet important details to go over on how all this is going to work. But if you're feeling impatient or you don't care about any of that, just skip ahead. There are some chapter markers down below for a reason. Now, the way this is going to work is that I'm going to rank all three of these in a variety of categories, and points will be awarded appropriately. So there's going to be 3 points for first place, the second place watch gets 2 points, and 1 point for the watch that comes in last for each category. And then we'll add all this up. And there's not going to be any ties with this video. I'm forcing myself to pick a winner in each category. So no cheesing out saying everything is as good as everything else. And as always, I'm going to try to be as objective as possible with this, with an eye on just what's the best go anywhere, do anything sports watch here. But with all these types of videos, it's hard to be completely objective, and especially when these watches are so close, in terms of quality and just the designs. Now, as far as the three watches we'll be comparing, obviously the first one is the Jack Mason Canton, which was just released. Then there's the Christopher Ward C63 GMT, which has been out for quite a while now. And last, we have the Monta Triumph, which has been out the longest of the three. And this really brings me to my second big important point, and that's that the watches I'm comparing the Canton to aren't the best watches I could be comparing the Canton to. As the best watches wouldn't be the GMT C63, but the regular C63, and it wouldn't be the Monta Triumph, but the Monta Noble. Watches that are going to be more similar to what the Canton is. But the thing is, I'm using these two watches simply because they're the ones I have. They're the ones I own, they're the ones I have the most experience with. And even though I've seen a regular C63 and I've reviewed the Noble, when doing a video like this, I don't think you should go off memories, no matter how old they are. With comparison videos, it's best just to work with what you actually can hold in your hands at the same time. Plus, most of what I'm going to say about the GMT version of the C63 I think applies to the non-GMT. And the same is true with the Noble and the Triumph. Those actually share the same case with just a different bezel and dial. So this may not be a true apples to apples comparison, but I think it's close. And the last important thing to point out is that you'll actually be seeing two different Cantons in this video. There's going to be a black one and a green one. With part 1, the normal review I did earlier, that was of the black Canton prototype that was lent into me, which disappointingly had a bit of dust on the dial. And after that review video, Jack Mason reached out and apologized. They said that those prototypes weren't assembled in a dust-free environment, unlike the production units. So they asked if they could send over a production unit just so that I can show you what it really should look like. And since they were going to send over another watch, I asked them to send a different colorway just so that I could check it out. That said, let's get to it. And let me start by saying that all three of these watches are great. So if you're a Christopher Ward fan or a Monta fan, don't be offended if I say one is better than the other at something, as it's all relative to three great watches. But there can only be one winner in each category, and the first of which is case design. So here we're going to focus on just the design of the case. The next category will handle the execution, or the quality and craftsmanship of the case. But for case design, I think this is an easy win for Christopher Ward. Their light catcher cases are great, and especially compared to a standard case design, which is what the other two mostly are, where there's a solid sidewall with polished chamfers and narrowing lugs. But with Christopher Ward, with their light catcher cases, there's just a fantastic balance between the flowing curves, a bit of light catching flash, and a bit of subtle tooliness. It's not necessarily a complicated design, but it's a smart, intelligent design, so I think it easily gets the win. But as for the other two, well, honestly, they're pretty similar and pretty close. I do like that there's a slim polished chamfer on the bottom edge of the Canton, but for me, I think the Monta edges it out. Just with these thin chamfers on the inside of the lugs, this is something I love about the Monta. as they directly lead into the chamfers on the bracelet, giving it just this beautiful cohesive line. Now, as for the execution, the quality, the fit and finish here, it's a little bit of a different story. And I need to say here that I'm not an expert on this, so just bear that in mind. And if you disagree and you know more than I do, feel free to say down below. And for the most part, I think the finishing on all three of these is great. And the only way that I'm really seeing any differences is if I really zoom in and check out the macro shots. And here specifically, I'm looking at the quality of the grain on the brushed bits. The depth, how uniform, how linear it is, as well as how clear and defined the transition between those and the polished chamfers are. And if you haven't noticed, I am cheating just a little bit here, as I'm using the macro shots for the Monta Noble, not the Triumph. And that's because when I bought my Triumph, I bought it used and it was already a little bit scratched up, so those macros aren't the best. Meanwhile, the Noble has the same case and it was much cleaner when they lent it to me. But here, I think you can tell some slight differences between the three. On the C63 Sealander, the brush grain isn't quite as defined, and maybe not quite as linear as the others. While on the Jack Mason and the Monta, they're pretty close. And if I have to pick a winner between those two, and I'm forcing myself to, I think I'm going to go with the Monta, as I think the grain here is much more defined. But again, they're all great. And especially just with the clear defined transitions between the polished chamfers and the brush parts. Now, next we're talking dial design. And for me, I'm going to be judging this more on what's the more interesting, more complex, better dial. I know some of you might judge this more on what's the more simple, straightforward dial, but I always like things a little bit more interesting. And here, I think this is a pretty easy one, as the C63 Sealander is a pretty standard basic dial design. It's effective, it's a classic layout, but it is pretty easy to do. And there's really nothing overly interesting about it, so I think it's going to come in last. Next is the Triumph. Now, this is the most unusual and interesting design out of all of them. And that's partly because this is maybe a little bit more of a field watch than your standard sports watch. Again, look at the Noble versus the Triumph. That's the more true sports watch. But with the Triumph, I particularly like these little cutouts for the indices on the outer edge, and especially since they're there not just for the applied indices, but also the painted ones. But again, it's also a pretty simple design. There's just 3 applied indices and the rest is painted on. Whereas when you take a look at the Canton, it's easily the most complex design when you look at it. There's a textured sunburst dial, as well as these unusual indices. I think someone in the other video called them coffin indices, where they have these polished wings on the outer edge of a brush square. And the overall effect, I think, is a cool combination, making the watch still somewhat subtle when you look at it, but a design that really comes to life as it moves around and catches the light. So I think the Canton wins here. However, one thing to note here is that if I was actually using the Noble and not the Triumph from Monta, and specifically the blue one I reviewed, I think that one might actually edge the Canton out. While it's still a simpler design, the fume gradient on the blue version is just amazing to see. It just pops and comes alive when you look at it. And I think it's still one of the best looking watches I've ever seen. Which now leads us to category 4, dial execution, or which dial has the best level of quality here. And again, for this, we gotta go to the macros. Now, I should point out that if you see any dust or debris in these shots, it's on top of the crystal, not on the dial, and that's my fault, not the watches. These are all pretty clean. But with the macros, I think this one is still pretty easy to judge. And let's start off with the clear winner, the Monta Triumph, where everything here is crisp, clean, and clear. Even when you really zoom in and check out the angles and rounded polished edges of the indices, it's just a beautiful watch to look at. Now in second place, there's the Sealander C63. And again, it's clean and crisp. And I especially love just how vibrant the orange lacquer is on the GMT when you zoom in. However, I don't think it's quite as good as the Monta, because when you zoom in here, the edges of those brushed indices look a little bit rougher compared to the smooth goodness of the Triumph. And I think this also shows off what is the genius of Christopher Ward, where they create designs that are maybe not as complicated as others, so they're probably easier to do, yet on your wrist, it comes across just as brilliant as the others. making it perhaps a more smarter design to use. As for the Canton, well, honestly, I had some high hopes for it. With a good-looking textured dial, beautiful hands, and an applied logo that looks great. But when you zoom into the indices, you'll see why it comes in last. As the brush top here looks really rough, barely making the grain out rough. Brushed parts under macro always look rough, but this especially does. And for comparison, here's a shot of a Formex Reef, a little bit more of an expensive watch. Again, the indices do look a little rough because they're brushed, but there's a much cleaner, defined pattern and grain to it. So Canton comes in last. And just for fun, let me show you this. This is probably the best dial I've ever seen for macro so far, where it's clean, crisp, and just full of Grand Seiko goodness. Let's move on to the bracelet. And before we really get into it, let me address the polished center link elephant in the room here. Because that's exactly what the Canton has, polished center links on an oyster style bracelet. And for some of you, that's all you need to know in order to disqualify it. However, I don't personally mind polished center links. If anything, my only concern with those is that they tend to get scratched to hell over time. But here with the Canton, it also has a scratch resistant coating, and that pretty much negates that. At least for a while. So for me, the polished center link thing here isn't an issue. And I think in some ways, a watch like this, a go anywhere, do anything kind of watch, should have some flash on it. That it shouldn't be just a straight tool watch, because sometimes you might need it for those dressy occasions. That said, let's move on to ranking these, and we might as well start off with the Christopher Ward C63, which has a great simple oyster style bracelet, one with great adjustable end links and a good adjustable clasp. So no complaints with this one. But it does come in last place here, as both of the other two watches have a better clasp, a more sophisticated design, female end links, and a better, more aggressive taper. Yet between the Canton and the Triumph, I think the Canton comes out just a little bit on top. The Triumph does have fully articulating links, giving it a pretty big edge there, and a more interesting clasp. But I can tell you from first-hand experience, that clasp can be a pain in the ass to use, especially when it's brand new. It's more of a friction clasp, so there's no buttons here, and sometimes it just sticks. And you just gotta apply a bit of force in order to pop it open. Now, with the Jack Mason, the links aren't fully articulating. And if you're curious, Peter, its designer, put out a video, I think on their Facebook group, just talking about why they decided not to do that, as they thought it would look better in the long run. Anyway, the bigger point here is that the Jack Mason has a better clasp than the Monta. It's a little thinner, not as wide, has more of a curvature to it, as well as it's just really easy to open up with these nice push buttons. Plus, the bracelet has these great quick release end links that are just as good as the Christopher Ward's, as well as that scratch resistant coating to top it all off. So I think the Jack Mason here gets the win. But there's one caveat that I should mention here, and that's that Christopher Ward does have a second type of bracelet you can get for the C63. It's a newer bracelet, I've never actually seen it, but supposedly it's pretty good. But again, since I haven't seen it, I can't really tell you how to compare here, but it is worth mentioning. And since we're already talking about bracelets, we might as well talk about wearability, or how comfortable it is on the wrist. And for those of you that are curious, this is a Formex Reef. So consider that my wrist check. And for the record, I do have a 7¼ inch wrist for those that are wanting to know. Now here, I can tell you that all three of these are great, and I've worn them a lot, including taking each of these on a vacation at some point or another, with the Canton prototype actually going with me on a recent Alaskan cruise. So from first-hand experience, I can tell you when it comes to comfort, you can't go wrong with any of these. But there are some minor differences in terms of how they wear. And out of the three, I think the Monta Triumph barely edges out a win. And I think it edges out the other two just thanks to its fully articulating links, as well as it being the thinnest and the lightest out of the three. And then we have the Canton coming out just a little bit ahead of the Christopher Ward. The clasp on the Canton is pretty similar to that of the Monta, but it does have more of an aggressive curvature to it. And I actually think that feels better on the bottom of my wrist. But overall, I think the Monta did feel a little bit better. And I think where the Christopher Ward falls a little bit short here is just because it's the heaviest, it's male end links, and it has wider links, making it just a little bit less comfortable than the others. But again, this is all relative to the other two, and they're all great. And I should also mention that there is a newer 36mm version of the Christopher Ward C63, both the GMT and the regular version. I actually saw it recently, and it is pretty comfortable on the wrist. So if you're looking for a smaller watch, I think that one would be the most comfortable out of all of these. Next up, LUME. And for sports watches, again, these are all great. All three of which can easily outpace a standard Seiko diver. But again, there can only be one. And to figure out which one is that, I just had to check out my comparison test. And notice here that the printed indices on the Triumph, those don't last quite as long as the applied or the hands. But overall, as you can see here, the Monta fades out first, while the Canton and the C63 battle it out neck for a while. Yet ultimately, I think the Canton just squeaks out a win here, as it's just slightly more visible when I pause it. Next up, we're going to talk about the movements. And here we have an LJP G100 in the Canton, as well as a Sellita SW330 in the C63 GMT, and a Sellita SW300 in the Triumph. And while I do personally have a preference for the newer LGP, I think it's a great movement. I think overall here, they're fairly comparable in terms of the quality as well as the grade of movement used. And I'm not sure about Christopher Ward, but I know Jack Mason and Monta further regulate their movements as well. However, I should point out here that I'm not an expert on the engineering or design of these movements, and I'm going more here off just the end user experience and what they offer you and what you can expect. So bear that in mind, and if you happen to hear something different from somebody that actually knows their stuff, listen to them, not me. But here, I think this is a pretty easy one to rank, with the Christopher Ward C63 coming out on top. It's not only a higher beat movement with an extended 56-hour power reserve, but also a GMT. Then you got the Jack Mason Canton and its LJP G100 movement. That I think comes in second place thanks to its 68-hour power reserve. With the Monta Triumph coming in last, as Monta seems to be using just the standard SW300 with the standard 40-hour power reserve. Now, in the past, when I do comparison videos, I usually throw in some categories like versatility and durability, but I'm not sure there's a point to that here. They all serve similar purposes with similar cases, and they all have 150 meters of water resistance. However, I do want to throw in ranking their features, like what extra stuff do they have over just a regular three-hander, if anything, as sometimes that can be a deciding factor. And here, the Monta is a typical just regular three-hander, and with the others, you got a GMT versus a scratch-resistant coating. And as much as I like a GMT, I think a scratch-resistant coating is much more important in day-to-day use. So for this, Canton gets the win, followed by the Christopher Ward, and Monta comes in last. And I do want to go off on just a little bit of a tangent here to stress how important I think that scratch-resistant coating is, as it is a little bit rare in this price range, or even higher. You see, below $1,000 it is becoming much more common to see, and that's a good thing. But not really above, just here out of these three watches, only one of them have it. And I think my Triumph is a great example of why I think this is important, because I bought it after it was only a couple of years old and it already had a fair amount of scratches. The case was okay, but the bracelet was all scratched to hell. Or another example is my Grand Seiko, as it, as well as most of the steel ones I've looked at, seem to be all scratched up, with a few exceptions. So as far as I'm concerned, Zaratsu polishing is amazing, but it scratches if you look at it funny. Anyway, we got two more categories to go through, and this is kind of another odd one I usually throw in, and that's uniqueness, which is just comparing how common a design is, or the watch itself would be. I know some of you don't care. In fact, the more popular a watch, the better, because you know it's good and you know it's reliable. But uniqueness is always something I like to consider. And I think this is a pretty easy one to rank. Christopher Ward and its C63 line are very popular. Plus, this is a lot of Explorer design cues, and a lot of people even just refer to it as a straight up homage. So it's easily the least unique. Now, in second place, I think we got Jack Mason, as it isn't quite as well known as the others, and it does have some very unique design elements when you really look into it. But overall, for a sports watch, it does follow the same basic formula that a lot of others do. Whereas with the Triumph, well, Monta is somewhat known, but still not very popular. And the Triumph here is probably its least popular model. Plus, on top of that, this design is very different. It's like Explorer meets Air King, along with some odd twists thrown in here. So I think it takes the lead in this category. And last, but certainly not least, let's talk value. And value here isn't just about price, but what you're getting for that price. However, in this case, honestly, the rankings follow the price anyways. So the C63 comes in first place, as it has an MSRP of $1,275 for the GMT, and I think just under $1,000 for the regular three-hander. And what you get for that is a fantastic watch. I think you could easily argue that the other two, with the Canton at $1,500 and the Monta at $1,700, are better watches, but it's hard to argue that it's 50% better than the Christopher Ward. And especially with what I was saying earlier, that Christopher Ward maybe has a smarter design, where the fit and finish may not be as good as the others, but the way it's designed, it doesn't need to be, and the experience on your wrist comes across as almost as good as the others. Now in second place, we have the Canton, and I think it does edge out the Monta just because it comes close to the Monta, but winds up giving you a little bit more. As with the Canton, you have a better movement, better bracelet, better LUME, and that scratch-resistant coating. Which leaves us with the Monta in last place. And this is a watch you could easily argue has the best quality out of the three, but it's got a price to match that as well. And for the record, the Noble, which is a little bit more like the Triumph, is $1,795, so a little bit more. Now, before I reveal the final score and ultimately the winner, I do feel like I always have to say something here, which is that the best watch, the one that wins, may not be the best watch for everyone, and especially when it comes to design elements of what each person likes. And really, which watch wins this whole competition isn't as important as the discussion that led up to this, where you really get into the details about what's different here. And especially with this video, as the whole point was just to see how this new ambitious watch from Jack Mason compared to two other respected staples. Alright, so enough talking about it, let's see the final score. And as you can see, with these three great watches, it's pretty close. In third place, we have the Christopher Ward C63 Sealander GMT with 20 points. Then the Monta Triumph with 22 points comes in second, while the Jack Mason Canton comes in first with 24. Bottom line is that this video is already pretty long, but there are also three great watches here. The Jack Mason Canton is the winner here, but that may not necessarily be the whole story. Remember what I said about the discussion being more important than the winner? Well, my personal take on this is that if you want the highest quality Microbrand sports watch and you don't mind paying for it, Monta is the way to go, either with the Triumph or the Noble. And while I haven't reviewed it, the Formix Essence is also pretty nice. Then there's the Christopher Ward C63, which is going to be the more popular choice with a much more attractive price tag. Yet, I think the C63 may wind up being the smart choice or the clever choice here out of the three. Because while it is less, it's still a ton of watch. Whereas with the Jack Mason Canton, I think it winds up striking a balance between the two, and overall may come off as the more interesting choice. So if you happen to be looking for a great go anywhere, do anything kind of watch in this price range, I can recommend all three of these, as well as the regular C63 and the Monta Noble. If you're seriously looking into these, just go with your gut in terms of which one you like the best. And as for the scoring or who won this, if you disagree, let me know down below. I've always said that with these videos, that what I'm saying here isn't the final word, but more the beginning of a conversation. So as usual, let me know your thoughts down below on these, or if you can think of something that might be able to compete with them. And as always, you guys know what to do down below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.